Does the Bible contradict itself, especially in the Gospels? Would you say to someone who says to you, I believe the Bible contradicts itself? I'd say there are three essential issues in coming to terms, in gripping the reality of these differences, these tensions, if you will, in the Gospels. The first has to do with the ability to distinguish between the difference and a contradiction. What is the difference between a difference and a contradiction? A contradiction would be something like when the Titanic sank, there were survivors who said that the Titanic broke in half and then sank, while other survivors said no, it went down intact. That is a contradiction. There is no way to reconcile those two accounts. A difference, however, would be something like coming home to your wife and hearing her say to you, you wouldn't believe this, but an hour ago, a guy shows up to my door and he's from the publishing clearinghouse and he's given us a check for $15 million. But then an hour later, you hear her talking to her mom and she says, a little while ago, two guys show up at my house and one gave me a check for $15 million while the other man was filming the whole thing. And they say, I'm going to be on television. Now that's a difference, not a contradiction. One statement, one account, contains more information, while the first statement was not as exhaustive. Many of the alleged contradictions in the gospel we think we have are actually differences and not contradictions. The second issue is that we should look at and should understand the genre or literary type of the Gospels, because in their original context, according to the Greco-Roman background of that world, as it is in much of today's literature, there were certain literary liberties that were allowed because of their Greco-Roman background. For example, time compression includes the lack of precision when it comes to minor chronological details, such as the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. When you read what Matthew's account says, when you read the way Matthew wrote the account of the temptation of Jesus, you discover something that is chronologically set forth. Then when you read the same account in Luke, you find out that chronology is inverted. But you would not regard that as a contradiction. We would recognize that as a difference. Why? Because the chronology of that context does not alter the truth and the reality of the text. It doesn't change the context. Again, most of the differences can be looked at and understood as the genre or the literary type of the gospel rather than a contradiction. The third point I'd like to make is the importance of differences. The importance of differences, and that is, I don't see any direct contradictions in the gospel, but let's suppose for a moment that there were contradictions. That does not mean that the Gospels are unreliable. It may force us to revise some of our use of inerrancy, but it would not mean that they are historically unreliable. No more than the fact that the eyewitnesses who survived the sinking of the Titanic contradicted one another on whether the ship broke in half or whether it did not. That did not nullify the fact that the Titanic sank. So putting this in perspective, we see that none of this calls into question the historical reliability of the Gospels. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about the words of God, the investigation that you're making into the claims of Jesus Christ, submit those questions to us, and we would love to meet you right here in the Apologetic of Jesus Christ.